Welcome back to Copper Star Precision, the channel dedicated to getting you more points at your competitive shooting matches. So there's been a lot of change-ups at the NRL22. It's no longer NRL22.org. It is now NRL22.com. And with that comes some potential proposed changes for the 2025 season, which should start up in June or July here, right after Nationals. So lots of changes coming down the pike, especially for base class. So let's jump into what those were. Now, if you're part of the NRL 22 and you're a member, then you were given a survey regarding base class. So they did ask for feedback from the community. And if you're not part of NRL 22 and you go to the matches, I do suggest signing up. It keeps track of your scores. You can kind of see how you're doing against other people. Membership is not that expensive. I recommend doing it. It helps out grow the sport. But there was a survey released maybe 4 or 5 months back. I don't remember exactly when, but it specifically dealt with base class. And the results of this survey must have changed the rules. So there's definitely some huge changes that we're going to go over coming up for next season. So these are some of the questions. We can just run through these. Should the rifle be 100% factory specs? Should the MSRP of $1,300 for scope and rifle be changed? Should a tuner be allowed? Do you think that a rail mounted the bipod should be allowed, but the rail must be only secured by factory screw holes? A lot of interesting questions here. If the rail was allowed, should any piece of removable gear be allowed to be added on the rail? Should internal or external weights, permanent or removable, be allowed? Should barrels be allowed to be threaded if they not come that way from the factory? Should aftermarket or homemade cheek risers be allowed? Should cutting or permanent modification of the stock for any reason be allowed? Should bedding of the stock be allowed? Trigger modifications, aftermarket triggers, different things like bolt knobs, bolt handles, extended magazines, etc. Electronic levels was a point of contention, and should there be a price limitation on bipods? Obviously, something like the Harris bipod is kind of your entry-level bipod, but you can run a Skypod triple pole. That's heavy-duty triple pole. That's like $1,200, so more than the entire budget of the rifle and scope. So there were a lot of questions that came out of this, and we have some inclination about what the results will be. Now, these are proposed rules. They can be found on the new NRL22.com website. But a couple of things stuck out to me. You can go through and read the whole rules, and there's a change log at the bottom if you want to see kind of what happened. But this is what really stuck out to me. It was the changes to base class. So 3 major things, and then a couple other minor things. One is that the price is still limited to $1,300. With inflation the way it is, I think that's kind of a misstep. The fact that most MSRPs for rifles have gone up, a couple $100. Scope prices have gotten ridiculous. And the thing is, like, especially companies like Vortex, right? Vortex, I use their products, love their products. The MSRP on the Vortex website is nothing to do with what you can find that locally, or minimum advertised price, or something like that. I mean, there's a huge discrepancy between MSRP. Athlon, I think, is another company that kind of participates in this because everyone wants to get a deal, right? So I think Athlon does something where there's an MSRP, but there's almost always 25% off, even on the website, using a promo code that doesn't go away. So really the price is 25% less. So that seems like a misstep, not increasing the price limit. Just for point of reference, PRS Rimfire Precision Rifle Series, they have a production class where the rules are somewhat different to base class in NRL 22, but their limit is $1,500. I think that's more in line with where the market is, especially with inflation and rising prices. So there's nothing that says you need to spend that much on a rifle, but just having the option, especially when it comes to glass quality, I feel like there's a lot of good entry-level rifles if you want to get into this sport, but having a little bit more budget for higher-end glass, I think, really helps add to the sport. And what's great is that if you do go to open class in the future, you can bring that optic with you. You just move the optic from your base class rifle to your new open class rifle, and optics tend to hold their value a little bit more maybe than entry-level rifles. So being able to invest, buy once, cry once when it comes to an optic that is, mid-tier. Obviously, things like high-end Night Force and some of the Vortex Razor lines or a Collis, a Zico. Obviously, that's going to blow the budget out of the water and doesn't necessarily make sense for a base class rifle, and that's something maybe to aspire to in the future. But having like a good mid-tier optic, something around, I don't know, maybe the $1,000 range, maybe like a Strike Eagle, right? Vortex, which is 2 steps above. Like there's the Diamondback, and then there's the Venom, and then there's the Strike Eagle. So it's kind of like that mid-tier. It's below it's below like the Razor, and it's probably below the Viper PST, but it's a really good mid-range scope. And there's a lot of scopes in that would still work in an open class rifle. So I think that's a miss. What's really interesting here is point C, that barrel tuners are not allowed. So Eric Cortina is going to be crying. But also, really here, point D, safe adjustments to the factory trigger are allowed, but aftermarket triggers are prohibited. So if you guys followed my Ruger precision rimfire build, I put Timney triggers in all of my rifles. They're an Arizona company. I like to support local to Arizona, and they make a great product. I mean, if it was just made in Arizona and it was a piece of crap, I wouldn't use it. But they make really nice triggers. I know people like other triggers like Trigger Tech and that kind of stuff. I've been pretty brand loyal to Timney. No more aftermarket triggers. So if I want to participate in base class next year with my Ruger precision rimfire rifle, I have to go back to the factory trigger. It does say safe adjustments to the trigger are allowed, so you might be able to put some sort of spring kit or something like that, lower the trigger weight as long as it's safe. That also seems like kind of a misstep. The trigger is the thing that you interact with, the rifle the most, in essence, when you're competing, right? And that's really like a personal preference. And I think having a lighter trigger pull for me is definitely an advantage in the sense that it aids in being more precise. You don't have these really heavy trigger pulls, and some of these factory triggers on some of these rifles are downright awful. But if you got like a Bergara, right, that uses Remington 700 trigger pattern triggers, and there is a huge aftermarket support for that trigger, so you can really dial in what you like, but not anymore. There's a couple other things in the rules that you can read through, but these are the ones that really stood out the most to me. So no more aftermarket triggers and no barrel tuners. I don't think barrel tuners is like a make or break, but the trigger was probably the biggest one. There was one really interesting improvement in the rules, so it's not all bad news. And that is in regards to the commands that can be given during the stage. So this is really interesting, and this can really kind of change the sport. And it kind of puts more onus on people spotting, people running the stage, and that kind of stuff. So up top here with the green highlight is last year's rules, or actually technically it's still currently this season's rules. So if you're a range officer, and usually what happens is there's not dedicated range officers at local club matches, at larger X matches, and obviously, regional finales and national matches, you're going to probably have dedicated range officers. Or what is more likely the case in most matches that people go to is that whatever squad you're in is, they police themselves to an extent. So as it currently stands for this season, the only calls that you can give are impact left target, like if you're switching between, or if there's a stage where, you have to hit left or right or something. I don't know. We haven't had one of those in a while, but basically impact and re-engage are the only commands that are allowed to be said. You can't say, oh, you were off left, or you're shooting low, did you check your dope, that kind of stuff. If you're a new competitor or a young gun or anything like that, I think it's a common practice that we help out as much as possible. We don't want to be gatekeepers to the sport, but if you're a more seasoned competitor, usually the only feedback you got was impact. If you missed the target, nothing was said. But if you missed the target and it was a hit to move on stage, the command would be re-engage. So you missed the target, you have to go back and re-engage that target. But check out this new rule for 2025 season. You can now call impact, wrong target, wrong position, re-engage, and you can ask during the stage on the clock close-ended questions that can be basically answered with a yes or a no. So if you are if you got lost in the course of fire and the sequence of fire, you can say, "Am I on the far target?" Correct, and they can answer. The other people on the stage can answer yes or no. You wouldn't be able to say, "No, you're on the middle target," but you can actually ask close-ended questions. So that second example here that is highlighted is what target am I on is an open-ended question. So that's a really interesting change to the sport that you don't really see in other sports, especially as things get more competitive. But now it is actually in the rules that you can say wrong target, wrong position. So if you were supposed to move, let's say from a tank trap tip to another tank trap tip, and you didn't move, but they hit the right target, you could say wrong position, so the person knows, oh crap, I was supposed to move. And so that's going to be interesting to see how that's kind of, I wouldn't say enforced. Doesn't say, that you're obligated to do this, and it kind of will introduce something into the sport. If you go to a match and you're on a stage, and you're in a squad that's very attentive, everyone's there to like help each other and that kind of stuff. You could have a squad that is much better about adhering to these new rules than a squad that's kind of sitting there. They're kind of there just for a social gathering, not really there to compete. They're competing, but they're just there to have fun and a little bit more relaxed when it comes to the sport versus a squad that's very active, really trying to see what you're doing, trying to help you out, and using these new calls, wrong target, wrong position, and answering your questions on the stage about, am I supposed to engage the smallest KYL target, yes or no? So that's going to be interesting to see how that kind of pans out. So be nice to your squad mates and, really help them, and they will hopefully return the favor if they're not jerks. So this will also be a challenge for match directors to kind of encourage people at their matches to adhere to these new kind of standards of what can be said, what kind of quote unquote coaching can be done on the clock. Again, you can't give win calls. You can't give like high low if your data on previous engagement is off, if your elevation's off. You're not going to be doing that, or hey, the wind's coming from right to left, or the wind switched on you. You're not going to be technically allowed to do that. Although, again, younger shooters, newer shooters, we definitely try and help give them all the advantages that they can during their first couple forays into the sport. But this I thought was really interesting, and I'd probably a positive for the sport as long as you have good squad mates. And part of having good squad mates is being a good squad mate. So something to keep in mind for the 2025 season. All that being said, again, I think it was a miss on the not increasing the budget. These are proposed rule changes, so things could change in the next. We have about, I guess, 2 months before the next season starts. However, last year they counted May as the first match of the next year, so we might only be a month away. Kind of unclear. So we'll get final clarity on this a little bit later. But I did release these videos about 2 years ago now for, I think it was the 2022-2023 season. The left one was like, what is the best base class rifle for NRL22? And the right one was, what is the best scope choice for NRL22? And it's probably about time I revisited these, especially with the new rules once they're finalized. There's going to be a real shakeup, but obviously, if I'm going to use the Ruger Precision Rifle, rimfire rifle, I'm going to have to go back to factory trigger if these rules stand the way they are. But I have maybe a couple other ideas that might be pretty interesting for those people who are looking to get the most out of base class under that $1,300 budget. So if there's some rifle or scope, particularly a rifle scope combination, because they both have to be, the total MSRP of both, as dictated by the manufacturer, has to be under $1,300. So if you think there's a rifle scope combination that I should consider when it comes to recommending or reviewing or giving people ideas on what they could use for base class, I'd really like to hear those in the comments below. These are probably some of my 2 most watched videos. I always get views on these. They've got tens of thousands of views already, and I still get comments to this day on these 2 videos. So it's probably high time I redo them. This is way back when the channel first started. They're pretty crappy video quality. So hopefully I can bring a little bit level of a little bit more professionalism to these. And my plan is I have a couple people in the clubs that I shoot at who have a lot of the base class traditional rifles. So you're talking entry level CZs, Tikka T1X, the entry level Bergara BMR, and a couple others, a Savage. So I might be able to interview them and maybe get their points of view. So you're not just listening to me uh, tell you what I think the best rifle is. So we can actually hear it from people who compete with these rifles. So if there's a combination rifle, scope, or I know I limited it to like 4 from each category, but there's definitely more out there. So if maybe there's something I haven't heard of that is worth taking a look at. So please let me know in the comments what you want to hear reviewed or talked about or suggested, and we can try and kind of redo these videos for the new rules coming up. With I already have kind of a little bit of bias in my mind to where might go with base class this year. So I'm curious to see if people agree with me or disagree. So that being the case, love to hear your comments down below regarding the rules. What do you think about the changes? And what do you think, given this kind of new rule set, what might be the best base class rifle scope combination? Or in addition, what would you like to see me review? That's all I have for today. Until I see you next time, as always, score more points.